During the French Revolutionary Wars and the Napoleonic Wars, the British Navy was stretched thin, so in 1790 they introduced a quota system, and this required that each county provide a set amount of men to the Navy based on that county's population. But Britain seems to have recruited people from all over the world. For instance, at the Battle of Trafalgar, there were 115 Italians, 9 Russians, 361 Americans, 78 Swedes, 17 Africans, and 123 from the Caribbean. Plus, there were also Maltese, Norwegian, and even some French amongst the ranks. Now, it's hard to know how these people were recruited, but of course, the British did use impressment. However, I think there are a fair few misconceptions about impressment that I'd like to address. First, I should say that in peacetime throughout the 18th century, the Royal Navy had about 15,000 men on average, whereas the Merchant Navy had about 40,000 men. And this is largely because the Merchant Navy actually increased pay over time, whereas the Royal Navy did not. So in wartime, the Royal Navy needed to boost their numbers and impress people. On to the misconceptions. First of all, the King's shilling. Now, this is the belief that press gangs would trick a man into accepting a shilling. He therefore had accepted the King's money and then could be whisked away into the Navy, but this just isn't true at all. And it's also untrue that anybody was impressed. Well, anybody could be impressed, but it was remarkably uncommon for landsmen, people without sailing experience, to be impressed. And they very rarely impressed people on land. They always did it at sea. Well, most of the time they did it at sea anyway. There are, of course, examples of people trying to impress civilians on land, but they are incredibly rare. But to give you one example, in 1803 in Dorset, press gangs tried to recruit civilians there. This ended in a massacre, actually. However, again, it's incredibly rare because the Navy wanted good sailors. So most men were impressed at sea, and in fact many came from the Merchant Navy, and this was entirely legal for the Navy to do so long as they replaced the man. So they'd go onto a Merchant Navy ship, take the good sailors and leave them with new recruits or something like that, or, rare occasions, the odd landsman. And in particularly desperate times, they could blockade small fishing villages and just force the Merchant Navy to give men over. And it was at sea that the British impressed men at the beginning of the War of 1812, and their justification for this, by the way, was that the sailors that they were impressing were in fact British citizens who had just fled to America. And historically there was a precedent for it. For instance, in the Tudor period, they often used to send the vagrants, as they called them, into the Navy as a sort of punishment. But impressment quickly died out after the Napoleonic Wars, largely due to a lack of demand and an angered public.